Chapter 2, Sink or Swim. Here's what I learned. A wood block is heavier than a plastic bottle cap. Which one floats? Both. A piece of aluminum foil isn't nearly as heavy as a block of wood, but when you roll it up into a ball, it drops to the bottom of the water like a small sunken ship. A ball of clay sinks like a great big shipwreck. When you spread the foil out in the shape of a little boat, it floats, though I'm not sure I'd try sailing in it. By golly, when you spread the clay out into a little boat, it floats too. I saw it all with my own little hamster eyes, but when Mrs. Brisbane asked why the foil and clay boats floated when the balls didn't, I was squeakless. So were my friends. "Come on, try a guess then," Mr. Fitch said in an encouraging voice. "What was the question again?" asked Pay Attention Art Patel. "Why did the foil and clay boats float, but the balls didn't?" Mrs. Brisbane patiently repeated. Art shrugged. "You look like you have an idea," Mr. Fitch said to speak up Saya. I stood up extra high on my tiptoes to see my shy friends. "Well," she said in a soft voice, "I think it's because it's spread out and there's more water underneath it to hold the weight." Leave it to Saya to say something clever. I was so glad that she wasn't too shy to speak up any more. "Bingo," Mr. Fitch said. Even though I thought Miss Bingo was a dog in a song, I knew he was telling her it was the right answer. It just had to be. There was more to whether something floats or not than just how much it weighs. Once again, I'd learned something new, which is the amazing thing about school. "Let's try some more stuff," said Heidi, without raising her hand again. I thought it was a great idea, but suddenly a loud voice that did not belong to AJ said, "Excuse me for interrupting. I need to check the temperature." I recognized that voice right away. It was big, it was bossy. It, of course, was the voice of Mrs. Wright. Who else but Mrs. Wright would be checking the temperature of the library? It wasn't even sick. Was something wrong, Mrs. Wright? The librarian asked. "I believe the temperature control is not working properly," she said. "And as the new chairperson of the committee of the school property, I need to keep track." Mrs. Wright taught physical education at Longfellow School. Thank goodness she didn't teach in room 26. In physical education, they play all kinds of games and sports which have rules. Mrs. Wright loved rules. Mrs. Wright loved her whistle, and Mrs. Wright didn't love me. "Come on in," Mr. Fitch said. Mrs. Wright scurried across the room in her puffy white shoes. She headed for the temperature control on the wall. But before she reached it, her puffy white shoes stopped right in their tracks next to the edge of my table. "What is it doing here?" she asked huffily. "It," asked Mr. Fitch, "was an it. What is an it?" It was pretty clear what it Mrs. Wright was talking about. She was staring right at me. "The rat," she said. Mrs. Brisbane quickly corrected her. "Hamster." "Whatever," Mrs. Wright replied. "He doesn't belong in the library." Mr. Fitch smiled. "Because he's not a book?" "Because he's out of his cage. It's unsanitary. What about his waste? Where will it go?" It was very quiet in the library until suddenly Kirk laughed. "She means his poo," he said. The word poo started the rest of the class laughing out loud. Heidi and Gail giggled. Kirk and Richie rolled their eyes and elbows at each other. Even Miranda and Saya chuckled. Mr. Fitch bit his lip, and Mrs. Brisbane shook her head. "My poo is just a part of life, but for some reason it makes children giggle, and sometimes makes grown-ups nervous. I don't know why, because I keep my poo far away from the food and everything else in my cage. In my view, you won't find a cleaner animal than a hamster." Mrs. Brisbane took 2 steps toward Mrs. Wright. "What waste?" she asked. "I don't see any waste." "You know," said Mrs. Wright. "Weren't you here to check the temperature?" asked Mrs. Brisbane, looking. Mrs. Wright looked right in the eyes. It does feel a little chilly in here." That caught Mrs. Wright off guard. "Really? I thought it was a little warm," she said, hurrying toward the temperature control. While Mrs. Wright fiddled with the control, Mrs. Brisbane continued talking to us. "Class, we'll be returning to room 26 now, but we'll be coming back soon because Mr. Fitch will be helping us with the new unit we're beginning," she said. "I'll tell you about it in a little later today." Surprisingly, Saya raised her hand. Mrs. Brisbane called on her right away. "Could we please check out some books?" she asked in her sweet, soft voice. Mrs. Brisbane and Mr. Fitch exchanged looks. Then they both nodded. "Okay," said Mr. Fitch. "You've got 10 minutes. Did you ever cross your fingers and hope for something special? I don't actually have fingers, so I closed my eyes, crossed my toes, both sets, and made my wish. Wishes are funny. Most of the time they don't come true. Sometimes they come true and later you wish they hadn't. But once in a while, you make a wish, it happens, and it's a good thing. That's what happened in the library. I wish that Mrs. Brisbane would pick up the pirate book about Jolly Roger. I couldn't check it out because I don't have a library card. And what do you know? She did. Yes, 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 I exclaimed as Garth carried me out in my hamster ball. I was so happy that when I saw Mrs. Wright leaning in over the temperature control as I left, she didn't even worry me. Not very much anyway. My next wish came true after lunch, when Mrs. Brisbane began reading that book to us. The full title was Jolly Roger's Guide to Life, and it was about a boy and a girl named Violet and Victor who are sent to spend the summer with their mysterious Uncle J.R. You can imagine their surprise and mine when he turns out to be a pirate called Jolly Roger, and he decides to teach them to be pirates too. Then they set sail to find lost pirate treasure. My fur tingled and I was hanging on every word when the teacher suddenly closed the book. The other students groaned and I was unspeakably disappointed until Mrs. Brisbane said she wanted to tell us exciting news. Og, did you hear? I squeaked with delight. Exciting news. Boing, my neighbors answered in his odd, twangy voice. That green frogs like him twangy voice that green frogs like him have, but he didn't sound particularly excited. The reason we talked about that what floats is that tomorrow we'll start a project about sailing, she said. We'll be doing sailing problems in math and science, and then you'll start building your own model sailboats. My friends murmured excitedly when Mrs. Brisbane paused and then cleared her throat. 3 weeks from tomorrow, if the weather is good, we'll go to Potter's Pond for a contest to see which of your sailboats can get across the water first. We'll have a picnic and prizes and maybe, Mrs. Brisbane paused again, hidden treasure. Potter's Pond, picnic, prizes, treasure. My heart pounded at the possibilities, and my classmates' cheers were almost deafening. What are the prizes? Heidi asked. Raise your hand, Heidi, Mrs. Brisbane answered. The prizes will be a surprise. My friends groaned again, and I let out a bit of a squeak myself. By afternoon, Mrs. Brisbane had written the rules for the sailboat contest on the chalkboard. 1. Each student will work with a partner. 2. The boat must be powered by the wind. No batteries or remote controls can be used. 3. All students will be given the same materials for their boats, but they will be allowed to add one item of their choosing, except for batteries. 4. Materials will include wood, cardboard, cloth, paint, glue, markers, and other art supplies. 5. The first boat to make it from the starting point to the opposite shore of Potter's Pond will win the grand prize for most seaworthy. 6. There will be a prize for most beautiful boat. At the end of the day, my friends were still chattering away about sailboats as they rushed out of class. Once the coast was clear, I shouted to my neighbor, Og, did you hear all that? She said all students. I wonder if... I didn't dare finish that thought. Most of the time, I did everything my friends in room 26 did, like taking tests and learning new things. Sometimes we even had games or parties, and I was right there with the rest of them. But sometimes I was left out. Recess, lunch, PE, field trips. Still, I could hope. I was so busy hoping I didn't realize that it was night time until the door flew open. The lights came on, and a familiar voice said, Give a cheer, 'cause Aldo's here. Greetings, Aldo, I answered, as he wheeled in his cleaning cart. Did you hear about the wonderful contest? As usual, all that came out was squeak, squeak, squeak. I'm not sure if he understood me, but as he cleaned the room, he noticed the vocabulary words on one chalkboard and the rules for the contest on the other. So that's what you're worked up about, Humphrey, he said with a hearty laugh. I'd like to be a part of that. Me too, I answered, and Og splashed wildly. That gives me a great idea, Aldo announced. I waited breathlessly for him to say more. Instead, he started sweeping up the aisles of the classroom. Occasionally, I'd hear him chuckle, but I had no idea what he was thinking. Squeak up, I finally insisted. You'll see, Aldo answered, all in good time. What was that all about? I asked Og, and Aldo was gone. Boing, boing, Og replied. Then he leaped into the water side of his tank. While he was splishing and splashing, I daydreamed about life on the open sea, riding the waves, going up and down, up and down. I stopped thinking about that when my tummy got a little queasy. If I had a boat, I could sail the 7 seas. I could sail anywhere in the world. I could even sail to far off Brazil, where Miss Mac lived. Miss Mac, she was my first human friend, and what a friend she was. She was full of life with her bouncy black curls, her big happy smile, her large dark eyes. She was also adventurous. She even took me on a bike ride once, and at night she liked to play bongo drums. Life with Miss Mac was the best. Then she broke my heart when Mrs. Brisbane came back to room 26, and Miss Mac left for Brazil. A broken heart hurts a lot. Sure, she sent us letters and pictures, but it wasn't like seeing her every day. At first, I didn't think I'd ever squeak to her again. But by now, my heart wasn't exactly broken, it was just sprained. And I'd be glad if I could see her again. I don't think Miss Mac meant to break my heart. I don't think Miss Mac would be glad to see me again. I do think Mrs. Mac would be glad to see me again, too. Funny how a book about pirates gets you to thinking about all kinds of crazy things, even love. There be treasures aplenty in the deep if you dare look, from Jolly Roger's Guide to Life by I.C. Waters.